I know you think, oh, it's just those rubes in Minnesota that are having problems. Let me tell you, it's probably happening in your state, and you just don't have a flippin' clue. Are you following local politics? Are you looking at the system? Do you know anything about IT? Do you know how bad those systems are? Have you talked to somebody who works in those areas? They'll tell you it's bad. So don't think that you're better because you live in California. You're not. This stuff is happening everywhere. Hello, and welcome to the Rundown Report. As a rundown mom, I have questions about many things. I rarely get to find answers. Here is where I attempt to understand the world. Most of my work can be found on Substack and Lightening Up at Minnesota Nice Ice Baby. Please consider becoming a paid subscriber, as this helps me create more content that you can enjoy. If you already are a subscriber, thank you. Anything you do to support my work means the world to me. Like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Tell me if and when I get it wrong, as I value your point of view. Today I will be talking about fraud in my home state of Minnesota. I will link a few articles I wrote about Minnesota politics on my Lightening Up Substack for reference. First, I'm discussing Minnesota and fraud this week after Ryan Thorpe and Christopher Rufo wrote an article in City Journal that covers fraud and the links to the Somali community in Minnesota. I will link that article in the show notes as well. So what does it discuss? The article goes on to connect some of the fraudulent money and all money in general sent from the Minnesota Somali community to funding the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, it's a Sunni Islamic militant political terrorist group based in Somalia. Minnesota has 37.5% of all of the Somali population of America. So up front, I differ with the City Journal article. I feel the focus on the Somali population, though warranted, detracts from the larger problem of bad governance, bad policies, and really poor systems within the Minnesota state government that need to be addressed. Most of the rundowns of this fraud in Minnesota start with the Feeding Our Future scheme, but I want to go back further. If you go back to 2010 in Rochester, Minnesota, 2 women of the Somali community were accused of providing material support to Al-Shabaab. Later, about a year later, they were convicted. They claimed that they were providing clothing and help for the needy. The women were alleged to go door to door for donations. Money was wired to Al-Shabaab through various means, which made banks and wire transfer operations scrutinize money sent to Somalia and ultimately charge more. This may have increased use of hawalas to bring cash to Somalia. There was another instance of fraud in 2018. A few whistleblowers inside DHS triggered an investigation which found fraud within the Minnesota Child Care Assistance Program inside of DHS. This was covered by Fox News 9, which stated that there may be up to $100 million of fraud. However, the Somali community protested, alleging Islamophobia. Then, the Minnesota State Legislative Auditor investigated the whistleblower, Scott Stillman, in 2019. The audit stated that they did not have evidence for $100 million of fraud. Instead, there was fraud, but it was only $5 to $6 million. And it was connected to the Somali community. So, even in 2019, Minnesota knew that fraud was happening, but dismissed insider concerns that the amount was far larger. There is a report in the Minnesota Post from 2018 by Ibrahim Hirsi, where he talks about interviewing Glenn Kearns, former Seattle police detective, someone who was interviewed by Thorpe and Rufo for their story. In 2018, this detective Glenn Kearns had found Somali money headed out of the airport and Al-Shabaab support. It is unclear how many people fly out to Somalia with suitcases full of cash through this method that the Rufo report talks about. which is to use hawalas, traditional money changers. One individual can bring up to $10,000 cash per trip, though this may flag TSA and customs. I will discuss hawalas after we talk about the recent fraud. Now, we come to the Feeding Our Future scheme. Minnesota's pulled off the largest COVID-19 fraud with $250 to $300 million that is gone. So it's gone. The Feeding Our Future scheme was the brainchild of Amy Bach and Salim Saeed and involved over 70 members of the Somali community in Minnesota, and was envisioned as a way to rip off the government during a time when they were not present thanks to COVID-19. During those investigations and that trial, it was found that Asha Farhan Hassan, one of the Feeding Our Future fraudsters, was involved in Medicaid fraud as well. So that led to further federal investigations. There were a number of people within the Somali community that were involved with autism center fraud schemes involving the Department of Human Services, DHS. Investigations found fraud in one of the new programs, Housing and Stabilization Services, which was envisioned by legislators as trying to lower the barriers of entry for the elderly, disabled, people dealing with addiction and homelessness, trying to help them find help more easily. Federal Attorney Joe Thompson estimated that there are probably billions of dollars of fraud, and the Housing and Stabilization Program has been shut down since that time. But wait, there's more, as they say. Joe Thompson found not only fraud, but blatant, uninvestigated, unacknowledged fraud. He found fake businesses, fake doctors, fake providers, fake storefronts, fake receipts, and fake patients. Worse, you had people taking advantage of poor, disabled, and addicted people, using their identities to take anything that they might be due for. So they weren't getting the services that were intended for them. So either there were fake people receiving fake services, or there were real people that didn't get any services because somebody else stole the money. Now, not all of these scams involve the Somali community, but the most high-profile ones have happened among that group. In the City Journal article, an anonymous speaker said the largest funder of Al-Shabaab is the Minnesota taxpayer. This is where I want to come back to the idea of hawalas, or clan-based money traders, that I mentioned before. The hawalas, because they're bringing cash to Somalia. In practice, Al-Shabaab takes some of this money as a tax, and in some cases takes all of that money. The biggest question mark brought up by this City Journal report is how much support is going out of Minnesota to Somalia, and how much is ending up in the hands of Al-Shabaab. If any amount of the fraud that the Somali community, or a small amount of them, have been engaging in, if that money is going back to Somalia, it will probably fall in the hands of Al-Shabaab. That is where you can make that statement, as Rufo has done here. However, it is unclear how much is occurring. People on the right are suggesting that a number of Somali are receiving money from Minnesota assistance programs, which are administered by DHS. All low-income Minnesotans can qualify for MinCare, the health insurance, regardless of immigration status. This will be ending at the end of this year. Regardless, when you come here, you're eligible as a refugee for a year of aid in Minnesota and other support. You're eligible for employee services and help for 5 years with job placement. How much of the community is using that? Obviously, you'd want to help them adjust to living in America. That's wanting to encourage assimilation into the culture. Right now, 58% of Somalis live below the threshold needed to to qualify for certain benefits through the state of Minnesota. Outside of programs through the state, the Somali community is also supported by religiously affiliated organizations. So it is possible that state welfare money is going through Somali Minnesotans to al-Shabaab, as many Somali would qualify for such aid. However, the state has made it more difficult to convert aid into cash. It might be happening, but is less plausible than fraud money funneled through fake nonprofits or fake people is going to Somalia. All of this has resulted in two things which will be important in Minnesota in the future. First, President Donald Trump revoked the temporary protected status for Minnesotan Somalis. That's going to allegedly affect only about 10% of that population. However, the question marks about money going to al-Shabaab open the door to Homeland Security entering. We have even more federal investigations. Now, whatever you feel about the Trump administration, Kristi Noem is coming to Minnesota. This isn't new, actually, other than run-ins with ICE. Minnesota also had investigations into legal immigration. In September of this year, Immigration Services did Operation Twin Shields, where they spent 10 days looking at immigration within Twin Cities region. They investigated about 1,000 different sites, individuals, businesses, and people claiming that they were legal immigrants. What they found was pretty astonishing. Over 50% had some form of fraud or abuse that included fraudulent marriages, visa overstays, H-1B abuse, fake companies, fake documents. So that uncovered quite a bit. While I appreciate that others outside of Minnesota are looking at Minnesota's problems, I will find it a waste of time if they only focus on the Somali population as the source of fraud. This does not mean that there isn't a significant issue within this community. And indeed, inside of Minnesota, many within the Somali immigrant community are approaching lawmakers and wanting to get rid of the bad actors, wanting to change the image of the community. But the bigger problem is within the systems that we have here in Minnesota. As I noted, there's loads of chances and opportunities for people who are struggling and suffering to receive aid and help. This is where most of the fraud has occurred. Part of the reason this has occurred has been our systems didn't have the ability to imagine that an entire population would take advantage of charitable goodwill. And in fact, that seems to be the case now. Given that, there needs to be better scrutiny of the systems. And indeed, the House has set up a committee called the House Fraud Committee. And by this fall, they proposed a new independent organization to analyze where fraud is occurring, how to prevent it, what things can be put in place. However, at that time, Tim Walz came back to Minnesota and decided that he was going to run for governor again. And he created an executive order fraud bureau under the Criminal Bureau of Apprehension, which of course reports to the governor. So it wouldn't be independent, but it already has these tools in place to do investigation and enforce law. The problem is that since that time, there is still money that's leaking out of DHS despite the work that's been done. That was discovered by KTSP 5 Channel News. That is worrisome. The other thing that has come out since that time is the House Fraud Committee met a number of times since spring. One of the meetings included interviewing the Secretary of State of Minnesota, Steve Simon. It's the most important finding of this meeting due to the License for All Act, which was passed in 2023, anyone, regardless of their citizenship status, to receive a license or state ID. Because Minnesota residents can get a license or state ID regardless of citizenship, they might use that to vote in election, either by registering online or voting in person on the day of the election. Simon made it clear that immigrants would be excluded from the automatic voter registration system. So it is possible, not necessarily plausible, that illegal immigrants and immigrants in general could be voting in Minnesota elections. However, because Minnesota is not turning over the voter rolls to federal authorities, we can't know. So at this point, it's a matter of the upcoming lawsuit. Still, this fed the narrative of looking again at the Somali community, blaming them that they might be involved in pay-to-vote schemes or other frauds involving voting, given that there is fraud within this community. Now, if you were an immigrant and you voted, you may be deported. So that is Steve Simon's defense. Most would not consider voting if we were not citizens. Every single person who I've met who is an immigrant, a legal immigrant, which is most of the people that work in the universities or in medical facilities, they wouldn't do something like that because they value law and order. But if we have people who don't value law and order, they don't value the rules, perhaps they're getting an incentive to do something like this, why wouldn't they just click a button online that says, yes, I attest I'm a citizen, and vote? Now, I'm not saying that fraud is occurring, has occurred. All I'm implying is that we live in a time right now in Minnesota where we didn't think this level of fraud would occur, that people would be willing, happy, and able to take advantage of people's goodwill and steal money. And we generally have a positive view of immigrants that have come through Minnesota, including the Vietnamese and the Hmong population, the Cambodian population, the Sudanese refugees that have come here and work in small communities all across Minnesota. People on the outside don't realize how many immigrants live in this state. There's a lot. So I've heard a lot of frustration inside of Minnesota from people who want to blame the Somali community. And I hear that from the outside. One thing that I've also seen lately, but less so than I did in the past, is criticisms of people pointing out the fraud as being racist or Islamophobic. I don't think that's going to work anymore, given the sheer amount and the facts that we see. This doesn't mean that you can apply this principle to all Somali in Minnesota, but the small population of people who were stealing money are stealing it from everyone. It doesn't matter. In Minnesota, we have tons of immigrants from many different places, different races, different ethnicities. They're stealing from all of them. Those people aren't going to have the services that were promised them. So, sorry, I don't care. And any attempts to try to block further investigation with claims of racism and Islamophobia need to be set to the side. There are people who are Muslim in Minnesota, other people from various places in Africa in Minnesota. They're not committing fraud. So tough titty. This needs to get done. I think that lets the real people to blame off the hook, which is to say who has been in charge in Minnesota for these many years. Here's what I said in my October article on Minnesota fraud, which is who's in charge. Under the guise of providing help for autistic people, housing for the disabled, homes for poor people, school lunches for kids, and aid to legal immigrants, fraudsters have outright stolen money from Minnesotans, most of which will be unrecoverable. If you cloak your nonprofit in the saintliest of guises, you can easily steal money. We can't let our legislature and our executive branch, including Tim Walz, off the hook for fraud occurring on their watch. They are the ones that were in charge of looking at these systems. They were supposed to protect our money from fraudulent use and abuse. It hasn't happened. And now I guarantee that Minnesota taxpayers are going to be holding the bag. We're going to feel it in our lack of money towards education and lack of money towards all sorts of things that the state provides. We have various runs coming up in 2026 for Minnesota Senate, House, the governor's race. I had given Tim Walz a try. As my daughter said, it's hard to hate somebody who runs on providing free school lunches for Minnesotans. But what does that cost? He has tried to position himself as a moderate candidate and everybody's grandpa. He's got an old truck and he's going to drive around Minnesota, even though he's from Nebraska. And even though he was out on the national stage loving it so much that he continued to do so, even though we were facing massive fraud in Minnesota, well, the results that he's had under his administration speak for themselves, and they are bad. Billions of dollars of fraud have occurred under Tim Walz's regime. There are allegations that people tried to bring attention within DHS of the fraud happening, and they were downplayed until the Feeding Our Future and other scandals forced the hand of people within these departments. This to me speaks of poor leadership. The minute that he knew there was massive fraud, he should have got back here and started doing more than making a trumped up committee within the executive branch to deal with it. I know that a lot of my friends want to talk about Trump and the Republicans and how they're toxic and bad and how everything ICE is doing is wrong and terrible. Here in Minnesota, I hear many people saying that you have the right to be upset and do political protests. But I find it abhorrent that a lot of these people don't want to talk about what is actually happening right now in our backyards. That's going to affect your kids, your family, you in the near future. The fraud, abuse, and also the prosecution of this fraud or the lack of is going to cause problems in our state for a very long time, more so than Trump saying mean things to people in Washington, D.C. That's what I believe is true. Last week's House Fraud Committee featured discussion of a new social program set to roll out next year, the Medical Leave Act. Again, another social program. Yet, one DFL representative remarked that if we crack down too much on fraud and we spend loads of resources preventing it, then the program becomes too burdened with administrative costs to help anyone. His point is that we should accept the paper-based reporting out of the fraud system, and he says that that should be good enough. Fact is, they seem to have no oversight previously. It's like DHS was actively preventing people from reporting the fraud. It's like their butt covering stopped working when billions of dollars went missing. So yes, administrative costs might increase when we want to protect our systems from rampant fraud and abuse. I just don't buy that this isn't worth doing, that we should rush forward with yet another plan to provide social services without having these procedures and systems in place. I'll not go into the long list of issues I saw in the new program, such as that the state's IT systems skim data off your medical record directly, though they say it's protected. Anyway, I'm saying that we're not done seeing fraud in Minnesota. Before I get too excited about some of the changes, I want to talk about some recent issues. There is other news. A judge in Hennepin County overturned the guilty verdict of Abtifada Yusuf, who stole $7.2 million from taxpayers. Jurors found this person guilty, and the judge overturned the ruling. That's bad. While I enjoyed the head of IT for Minnesota talking about putting in protections for data. A recent audit just found massive amounts of, fraud within the SNAP program being distributed by Minnesota. Millions of dollars more of fraud and lapses that leave the system open to breaches. What a surprise. Who could have thunk it? Pretty much everybody. We have a couple other candidates that are running for governor. We'll see who ends up sticking around. But there's Lisa Dameth, who has been the Speaker of the House. I'm more excited about people who are working politicians. I've enjoyed Lisa Dameth so far. So let's sum it up. I don't disagree that we need to look at the fraud happening within the Somali community in Minnesota, but I disagree with the tendency to focus just on the Somalis. We should prosecute people who've committed fraud, and we should look for more instances of fraud and abuse. We should resist the urge to scapegoat and form all-encompassing ways of viewing a population rather than stating the facts as they are. I think we need to keep our eyes on the prize. The bigger problem is within the Minnesota state government, their handling of the situation, their ability to address and find the fraud that is occurring. That means considering help from the federal government, whether or not we want to concede that. In my opinion, it means looking at new candidates outside of gravitating towards the progressive candidates in Minnesota. There's nothing wrong with having that desire to help people that truly need it. However, given the amount of fraud that's happened, continuing along and doubling down in the same manner is only going to hurt the populations that we want to help. We won't have money to provide because it's been taken by fraud. Oh my God. Geez. So what I'm saying is, if you truly want to make a difference, consider taking this situation seriously. Also, consider subscribing to Lightening Up, where I will let you know about Minnesota news when I'm not writing about funny, hilarious stuff in other areas of the country. I'll go back into this sad state of affairs in Minnesota. And by the way, if you're outside of Minnesota, you should subscribe too. I know you think, oh, it's just those rubes in Minnesota that are having problems, but let me tell you, it's probably happening in your state, and you just don't have a flippin' clue. I mean, are you following local politics? Are you looking at the systems that are in place? Do you know anything about IT? Do you know how bad those systems are? Have you talked to somebody who works in those areas? They'll tell you it's bad. So don't think that you're better because you live in, I don't know, California. You're not. This stuff is happening everywhere, and it's up to us as we the people to find it out. All right. Thanks for tuning in.